welcome back to my channel. I know that for the last couple of weeks or so, I've been talking about fallacies and going over logic and that sort of thing. This is going to be a different video. This is going to be a story time with Zoe. So grab a seat. You don't want to miss this one because you're probably looking at the title of this video and you're thinking, Zoe, what the hell is bad man bad? All right. This is about a conversation that I had on a Discord server. Now, just to kind of like set the mood, set the tone, all right? I was in a server talking with a couple of other people, and we were discussing mental health issues. And this was a conversation that I was really into. Now, there was about 5 of us in there. One person was using a lot of language that therapists use. And if you've ever been in therapy or counseling, you know what I'm talking about. When they talk about stuff like emotional transference, and they talk about boundaries, and they talk about making sure to, keep in mind of your own like emotional well-being. And this person kept talking about it in ways that it's not that it made me uncomfortable, but it made me kind of suspicious just because of my own paranoia, we'll say. All right, we'll just leave it at that. I'm a paranoid person in general, right? So I'm already suspicious of this person. And I even said to them, I said, hey, I noticed that you're using a lot of language of therapy. And then he said that, yeah, he was a therapist. Then I was just like, okay. Normally, therapists do not go into Discord channels and just start giving people like therapeutic advice. It's kind of unusual to start with. But one of the other people in the room was a psychology student, and he said that he was very interested in talking about the subject. So I was just listening to them talk back and forth. I have a lot of mental health issues, so it's always fascinating to me to listen to other people, like clinicians, talk about therapy, because I like seeing it from both as a patient and then from the, like, I would say like a proctor point of view. Well, one of the other people in the room kind of like pushed back a little bit because eventually the therapist guy said essentially the same advice that you would find in a book like The Gift, okay? In The Gift it says like, oh, if you just want something to come to you, you just think about it a lot or think positive thoughts about it and the universe will like bring it to you. So like if you think of money and wealth and success, eventually it'll come to you. He said something kind of like that, except he said if you smile more often, I know y'all can't see my face because of the mask, but trust me, in these videos I'm usually smiling. I'm a smiley bitch, what can I say? But he was saying if you smile all the time, it will change your mindset and you will eventually start feeling happier all the time. Now, that kind of like hit me the wrong way because I'm like, well, I struggle with depression sometimes. I'm not a major depressive disorder, but I have it enough that I'm like, I don't feel like if I just smile when I'm depressed, it'll make me feel better. And the other person that brought it up asked that very question because they have clinical depression. And they were just like, I've tried all these smiling stuff. I've tried all the like behavioral, like small behavioral corrections, and it hasn't really done anything for me. And this guy gets like immediately defensive and starts saying, well, it works for everyone. You just, have to get into the practice of it. The same thing with, mindfulness, which he also brought up. Now, mindfulness is kind of like it's a state where you become aware of what you become aware of what's going on in your body and externally around you. Like, what colors do you see? What are all the different things that like you can smell and taste and feel? And it's almost like a meditative state where you really focus inward on like, can you feel your heartbeat? Can you slow everything down? Can you feel your thoughts arising as they arise and just relax? All right. That's kind of like what mindfulness is. Anyway, he was saying like, mindfulness techniques. Now, the thing is, mindfulness legitimately does help a lot of people. It really does. And, I would say to anybody, if you're not aware of what mindfulness is, you should look into it and see if it can help you. If you, practice some meditations or whatever, it can be very helpful. Anyway, getting to the point of this, a person came into the room after that and started complaining about politics. And he said, I don't understand why people would vote against human rights, specifically trans rights, gay rights, or against minority communities, like voter suppression. If you became aware that your party was doing these things, why would you vote for them, right? And everybody in the room was kind of quiet for a second. And then he was expecting a debate. Nobody debated him. And then he was like, well, does anybody have an idea or an answer? And I said, well, I think I have an idea why people would, might vote for something like that. And he was like, what do you think is going on? And he said he's genuinely concerned or genuinely trying to figure out and get in their head of why they would vote for something like this. And my answer was, well, perhaps these people's ideology. Now think about it for a second. If you're talking about the Republican Party, we're already talking conservatives. And if you're talking about people who are already aware that they're voting against human rights and they are purposely doing it, or it might even appeal to them, that might be why they're voting. So what's the motivation of a person like that on the right? And my answer was probably somebody who's either a white nationalist, white supremacist, or a Christian dominionist. Now, before I explain what any of that is, the therapist that was in the room, who had been kind of like strangely quiet for a while, suddenly he was just like, oh, so your big brain take, Zoe, is that bad man bad. Now, forgive me for a second, but in my mind, that's like the Trump voters being like, oh, orange man bad type of stuff. And I just snapped at him because I have emotional dysregulation issues. And I was like, that's got to be one of the dumbest things that anybody's ever responded to me in the server. And I've had people like trolling the heck out of me, and I can just like easily sit there and talk with them and stuff. But this guy like legitimately made me angry with that comment. That's like one of the dumbest things that I've ever heard. So let's break this down. Somebody asked me, why would I think that the most extreme element of a conservative party was voting against human rights? Then I say Christian nationalism, white nationalism, white supremacy, or Christian dominionism. Now those three things are all like umbrella terms that account for a whole bunch of little political positions underneath it, right? So when you talk about white supremacy, we're talking people who are either, like possibly racist, people who want to maintain the hierarchical power structures that previously existed since the Reformation and the, after the Civil War, right? Especially going up from the like 1950s, and especially if we look at like, say the Southern strategy, right? We know that some element of the Republican Party has been on board with this, right? So there's definitely some white supremacy possibly going on there. And when you look at the white nationalists who, have websites like VDare and that support stuff, like organizations like the Proud Boys, they make it very clear with their like defending Confederate statues, objecting to like the Confederate flag being taken down, spreading the JQ and stuff like this, that not only are they white nationalists, and they will proudly tell you that they are white nationalists, but they are also white supremacists. QAnon also falls into this group along with into Christian dominionism, which people like Marjorie Taylor Greene have talked about being openly communicating with and okay with groups like the Proud Boys. And then you have other people who are like these Republican talking heads, like what's her name, Lauren Witzke. She's the infamous girl that told Blair White to grow a mustache. This woman has been a main contributor to VDare, and VDare is a white supremacist, white nationalist, alt-right website that's hugely popular. Its founder explicitly is racist and formed the website to fight against black rights, essentially, and just minorities in general. Her stances on LGBT people are basically genocidal, and that woman also had the Proud Boys do private security for her while she was running for office. So it's not like whenever I say white nationalism, white supremacy, Christian dominionism, and Christian dominionism, by the way, is the idea that Christians rightfully deserve to rule over the country and install a barbaric form of Christian law, similar to when you hear a lot of people on the right worry about Sharia, and they, are always like rattling their sabers about, Islamism and stuff like this. Christian dominionism is for America what Islamism is to Sharia, all right? Except in our country, Christian dominionism is actually a threat. And like Andrew Siddell wrote a book called America, the Founding Myth. It's a great book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend you go check it out. And it talks about America's roots of Christian dominionism and why this kind of like radical ideology among Christians is a threat to our legislative system. And when you look at laws and stuff that essentially promote and install Christian values, Christian morality, legislated as the law of the land, that's Christian dominionism. So whenever you see like the Trump putting in far-right Christian judges on the Supreme Court, that is a form of Christian dominionism. Whenever you see him packing the lower judicial branches, as long as they're like, Christians and stuff, when you see like Kim Davis in Kentucky talking about her faith ought to exclude her from issuing marriage licenses to gay couples, and she claims that her faith ought to allow her not to fulfill her civil duties, that's Christian dominionism. So, and it's all the things, this giant umbrella that goes along with it, such as like Chick-fil-A donating to anti-gay organizations, the Heritage Foundation, say the Family Research Council, all these different places that try to legislate Christianity or Christian values. And you hear the dog whistle for it all the time when they say stuff like America was founded on Christian values, or they try to tell you that morality itself comes from Christianity. When you hear stuff like that, just be aware that the person who's saying it either is a dominionist or they are a useful idiot, and they're propagating rhetoric and talking points that push the agenda of the Christian dominionists. And dominionists can be from any faith. It doesn't matter if they're Baptists, Protestants, Catholics, whatever, as long as they are trying to install a Christian government over the population and subjugate all of us, like dissolving gay marriage, saying that God created a natural hierarchy of man. So there's, man up here and woman under him and children under there, and then his slaves and his property under that. Christian dominionists support that. During the Civil War, dominionists fought for the Confederacy when they said that it was their Christian right to own slaves, which is biblically supported. They're dominionists. And to have, so I can offer all of this clarification, all of these examples, and walk this guy through all of it. But when he heard me say white nationalist, white supremacist, and Christian dominionists, his first response to me was, bad man, bad. I'm conservatism, and this is the thing, even when you listen to a therapist, somebody who's already talking about empathy, and we ought to have patience with people, and we ought to recognize that just because somebody has a different political opinion, they might not be my enemy, and he's trying to do all this like bridge building stuff, at least with his language. The fact that just on a dime he switched to be like, oh, bad man, bad, and to take my political arguments and to pretend that they're as reductionist as bad man bad or orange man bad was one of the most absurd straw men that I've ever been exposed to. And I've had some really bad faith people before try to ask me political questions, but this was just so unexpected and out of nowhere from somebody in this room. And then on top of that, after I explained to him like what I was talking about specifically, he couldn't refute any of it. And he's just like, oh, so you're just saying like all these ideas are just bad. And I'm like, yeah, racism, white nationalism, Christian dominionism, yeah, that's all bad. And then I was pointing out to other people in the room later on as we're having this conversation that they have to be aware of dog whistles that are going on. And there's also such things as like, say you have somebody who's doing advocacy for one group of people. And I was like, just because somebody is doing advocacy for a group does not by default make them like, intrinsically or inherently good. They can be, a mediocre person. They can waffle on different rights and stuff like that. And even though you would think that this person, let's say, if they're an ethical vegan and they're like, I care so much about animals, I want to make sure, animal rights, we shouldn't abuse animals this way, we ought to treat them well and all these other things. And you think like, okay, if someone cares this much about animals, then they probably also care a lot for like human rights and that type of thing. That's not always the case. I am a vegan, and I've listened to vegans give very passionate, very long speeches that are fiery and, get you riled up for animal rights, only to turn around and be 100% silent when it comes to human rights issues, like LGBT issues or Black Lives Matter. Now, this gentleman that was in the room with us, he said to me, don't you think that might be because an advocate only has so many spoons and they can only put so much energy into their advocacy? So it makes sense that if they're very passionate about something, they might only care about this one issue. That might be their primary platform. And I said, well, that's true, except we don't want to fall into the nirvana fallacy and believe that there's only one solution to the world's problems, or there's only one right way to do advocacy, and you just ignore all the other problems, which is what he's insinuating. My point is, we can advocate for multiple issues at the same time. And even if your primary advocacy, let's say mine is trans rights and LGBT rights, that doesn't mean that if somebody asks me, like, what do I think about BLM? I would say that, I support BLM, and we should have police reformation, and we should stop, redlining, and we should pay restitutions to the Black community. Like, I can support Black rights and Black liberation while also supporting veganism and also supporting trans issues and LGBT issues, including advocacy groups are often stronger when we all work together, like under some umbrella like the Human Rights Campaign or something like that. We have better access to lawyers, better access to other people who might, march lockstep with you to, fight for rights and that sort of thing. It's kind of fallacious to me. And I could tell what he was doing. And I was like, it's just very disingenuous to insinuate to me that, well, because somebody is doing vegan activism, they don't have time to do any other sort of activism. And I was saying, I'm not asking them to go and do a bunch of other activism. I just think it's kind of strange that if you're saying that, we don't do enough for animals and we have to advocate for them and everything else, that if somebody asks you, like, not even one tweet of all this account and all this stuff that people are doing, and people have asked you before or brought it up to, mention trans issues, and you don't mention trans issues at all. And the thing is, I'm not going to mention names and I'm not going to call it any drama here. I just find it interesting that this person not only is a huge vegan advocate, but also has done atheist activism too. And this is like a whole nother can of worms, as someone the other day told me that they didn't believe atheist activism was a thing. And I said, okay, what would you call it then when you have somebody who is an atheist and they are advocating for secular laws and secular values, a separation of church and state, and the only reason they're opposing certain laws or opposing certain organizations getting involved is because those are religious groups? Is that not atheist activism? And they conceded that point to their credit. And they said, well, sure, but that doesn't mean that just because they support, like, say, abortion or LGBT rights or something, they're not necessarily doing that because they're an atheist. And I said, no, but they would be doing it because they are fighting for secular humanism. And secular humanism, which does advocate for human rights, rights of people of color, LGBT rights, women's rights, women's right to access to healthcare, that's all included under secular humanism. Because otherwise, if you have somebody who's an atheist and they say that they're secular, but they are still following like religious morality or voting along with religious blocs to push religious conservatism, then that person, as I said before, would be a useful idiot to Christian dominionists who ultimately want to pass laws legislating biblical standards for things, which would eventually affect that secular person, which might, like, let's just say in the most kind of slippery slope our way all the way down, right? So Christian dominionists get what they want to, they pass all these laws of the Bible, and now this secular person who was voting with them finds out that he has to go to church on Sunday, or he has to not work on Sunday because that's in the Bible, and that's what these people are also demanding of everyone that lives in the state. I know that's a little hyperbole, but there are ways that these things can end up affecting these people, especially if they are secular, they're atheists, and they're gay, or they're trans, like a Caitlyn Jenner or a Blair White, who supports conservatism and tries to push this stuff into law, legislative politicians. What happens when enough of these Christian dominionists get in there and start reforming all of the laws in the state, like overturning Obergefell, where they get rid of the idea of, let's say, gay marriage. And then for some of these trans people that help vote for them, they say that, well, now the state is going to interpret your sex as based solely on what was your birth certificate. And if they're a woman that married a man, now they say, oh, well, in the eyes of the state now you're two men. And because we overturned Obergefell, we're forcibly divorcing you. This could happen if Christian Dominionists get their way. But a lot of these right-wingers that are useful idiots, and they're basically just self-hating people, like the Dave Rubins and that sort of thing, that are pushing to get these politicians elected to office, don't seem to be, and you know what it is, honestly, is they don't care, because most of them are wealthy enough that they could just move to wherever they want to, or they could just leave the country if things got that bad. It just seems like they have so much self-hatred that they are projecting that onto the greater community, and they're trying to harm all of us because of their own personal insecurities. Anyway, I think that about wraps up this story time. Hopefully you were kind of like, you stuck with me on this like long, strange journey, but I swear, on everything, it's like, here's a detailed political analysis about why somebody might be motivated enough to go and vote maliciously against human rights. These are some of the reasons I can think of off the top of my head. Just remember that any type of like political critique where you go through and you kind of like feel about the motivations of people, why they might do those things, and then you look at the political platforms that they support, then look at the extreme of that platform and find out what those people are advocating and what the adherents to it actually say. Just remember, that's just bad man bad. Oh well. I will see you in the next video.